cases of Liberia, the Liberian Crisis, and the African Exclusion Measure. And I will be on camera momentarily, as I said. So I'm going to, give you a little visual that is my legal property in regard to the Liberian Crisis. And oh, okay. I was trying to see if somebody was writing something in the chat. And then I am going to get into the content. So I'll be sharing all of this via the screen so that, everyone can follow along, particularly people who may or may not be in the WhatsApp group, which is where all of the information is disseminated. So no worries about that. And I'm going to hit on, these are the evidentiary chapters. If you were in our session last week, you know that I went through the process of explaining this one particular case of Washington and his transformation. That's mostly, hello from Zambia. Okay, he's saying his network is bad. I went through the process of explaining Washington's transformation and talking about why discussing ideological and political transformations as it relates to our people is so important. Because when we do discuss it, it allows for us to get a prescription or remedy, because some of these issues that we face in terms of acting in our collective interest, it's not new. These are not new problems, right? People who don't act in our collective interest, being in power. So we also need to know how to do that, right? And we also need to appreciate when people do that, right? With regard to us. So I've got my little cup of coffee. You will see me at my desk in a second. So we need to know and appreciate when it is done, and it is done properly, so to speak. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about two real cases where Booker T. Washington, in effect, did what he was supposed to do for African people, not just simply in the United States, but in the context of the African continent, African people globally. Okay, so that's where we're going this morning with that information. So let me see if I can get my camera together. It's a little sticky. Hold on. Okay. So that's what I'll be covering today. And I want to get a couple of slides together for you guys. Okay. Because shortly after you see me, I'm going to be sharing my camera and telling you about the Liberian Crisis. Okay. Somebody's saying they can't hear anything, but I hope everything you can hear now. Okay. So hopefully you all can see me. I don't know how good or bad the lighting is. So maybe I might use this lighting. Okay. So today we're in essence covering that. Hold on. I might have to go out for a second to turn my alarm off because this thing is going to keep going off. Anyway, so can everybody hear? Alex, I think people are having technical issues. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I can hear you. So I think if you joined and you can't hear, just try dropping from the call, then joining back again.
Okay. Okay, you
Then
can hear. Good. 1 second. Let me hold on 1 second, folks. Let me just plug myself in so I can get a little light. Okay. So you actually can see me better. Hold on 1 second. Let me just. Okay. All right. I'm going to keep my headset in because for me, that's better in terms of sound. Sorry. Let me just navigate these little issues for a second. Okay, so the Liberian Crisis is actually the first case in the book. And I've shown people the book, but you have most of the chapters of the book, so you have no need to get it from me. And this is the book that I'm teaching from. And it is called Booker T. Washington in Africa. Some of you all know it, but you have you actually have the money chapters. You have the money shots, so to speak. And I'm gonna show you another money shot today as we talk about the Liberian Crisis and the details of this particular case. So Washington, in effect, is the key negotiator in something called the Liberian Crisis. Now, all last week, I spent the time talking about this transformation that he had undergone, which is there in chapter 4. Those are the first 2 chapters we read in here, 2 and 4 on Pan-Africanism, and then on the chapter where he is engaging many African nationalists. And I think you all have the readings, but I went through some of the African nationalists in South Africa, in the scenario in Togo, why it wouldn't be considered Pan-Africanist, Washington's presence in the Sudan through his graduates, and his challenge to King Leopold and the atrocities being committed in the Congo under his regime. So it wasn't lost on Washington. At the beginning of this process, he is not. In 1900, when he begins to engage in Togo, he is not clear on what he is doing. By the end of this process, he is very clear as to what he is doing and for whom he is doing it for. Honestly, to be quite frank with you, you will become more sophisticated in your understanding of that in the course of this seminar. However, that is the crux of it. Okay. What are you doing and who are you doing it for, in essence? Okay. That is of the utmost importance. And so this really is just an exercise in looking at one human being who would serve African people and do so in a substantial way, in a measurable way, not in some mythic, altruistic, intangible way, but he will change the outcomes for Liberia in this case. And then we'll move on to the other case. We'll cover both of them during this session. So he will change the outcomes for Liberia, but he will also change the outcomes in the African exclusion measure, which actually impacts the African people globally. I'm laughing because I have kittens, folks, and they get most active when I'm on uh, live or on Zoom because they know that I can't. I don't know. I guess they know that they know that I don't get up and do anything to them, but they definitely try to test me. So, um, as one just did, climbing up my curtains. So sorry, I apologize. You get a chance to see this little one. But say hi because you're interrupting my session. Um, so look at now he wants to stay. Anyway, so the Liberian crisis is what we're talking about today. And essentially the outcomes are to the benefits of Africa, unlike the Togo, which was a catastrophe and not to the benefit of the African continent, to the Togolese people, or to the institution called Tuskegee. It was wholly Togo, right? That we talked about in the chapter 4. Togo was completely to the benefit of the German colonial regime. And we need to understand that. We need to understand those dynamics. Okay, so let's get into it. All right, good. I'm going to, Alex, I'm going to share my screen. Can you give me permission to do that? Hold on one second. No, don't do it just yet. Hold on. I'm about to share my screen. Let me close all this other stuff so that it works properly.
All right.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Okay, let me see. I want to just, okay. Okay. Okay, yes. Can you give me permission to share my screen?
Yes, you should be able to share it now.
Okay. But I did something I didn't want to do. Dang. Okay. All right, here we go. Screen. Start broadcast. Okay. Sorry, guys. I didn't mean to show you my screen on my phone. Okay, so as some of you may remember, I'm going to do it like this so that it's obvious. Some of you may remember we went through, some of these individuals that were involved in the International Conference on the Negro at Tuskegee. But this is what we're going to be talking about today, the Liberian Crisis. And yes, this is a real image of the Liberian delegation to the United States, by Booker T. Washington. So a commission from the United States would come to Liberia and essentially stay in Tuskegee for a couple of days and then go back to Washington, D.C. to negotiate the fate of their nation in terms of trying to end the encroachment of the French, British, and German colonial forces on their country, their budding nation. So I'm just going to read just a little bit from that. That's an image you can look at. And then I'm going to quickly go to the text. I'm going to tell you who those individuals are and then go into some of the details of the case. That being said, I hope to be very efficient today in terms of time, because sometimes I think and open it up much quicker than normal to questions. So maybe what I'll do is I'll cover Liberia, take questions, and then cover the African exclusion measure, which is very short case, so that you can get the chance to ask questions in between as opposed to just at one time in the end. Okay. So I'm acknowledging some of what I saw written last week about, just opening things up for dialogue a little bit more, right? And I agree. The chapter 5 that you have on the Liberian Crisis opens up with a quote from Washington that says, "No one, not even the citizens of Liberia, is more interested in the progress and success of the Republic than I am." So, in other words, he was saying that he was just as invested in the fate of Liberia as anyone, and that uh, he wasn't a Liberian, but he was no one that he knew, not even the indigenous Liberian person was more invested. In other words, he's trying to give you an understanding of how deeply invested he was in the fate of Liberia. Okay. And Liberia is a complex case. I hope you all got a chance to read the entire thing, because I give very great, sharp criticism of the uh, African American posture in Liberia. Okay. And I think this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about in terms of transformation and discussing it. There may not have been a transformation in Liberia in terms of the Americo-Liberian population. However, we need to talk about it because it is a work in progress, meaning that if the next time we have such an engagement between diasporic Africans and continental African people, we can do better than we did in the case of Liberia as a result of discussing something like the Liberian crisis and Washington's recommendations, which I'm going to get to. Then that means that criticizing it will have been instructive and prescriptive. And we need that, okay, as African people, as Black people, because the only thing that stops us from eradicating racism and xenophobia is our unity, right? Our unity will protect us from all of those things. So yes, we will have the conversations, the very difficult conversations, because it allows us, like we highlighted with Washington, it helps us to transform ourselves. Okay. And who cares about the other people watching who want to weaponize it or whatever? If it truly does for us what we need to do, right, an ideological transformation, then we will have the most benefit. And anything that they could come up with to detract, to disrupt, to disturb won't work anyway. Okay. I hope I'm not going too deep, but usually sometimes when someone wants to, I'll give you a perfect example of Malcolm X. Malcolm X always said, you can talk about me going to prison. I don't care. You can talk about me going to prison. That is not the stick to use on me. And why? Meaning you can't beat me with the "you went to prison" stick, because he owned it. He owned it. He admitted that he was a criminal. He admitted that he went through a process of transformation while he was in prison. Now, for someone to say, "Hey, you were a felon, you were a criminal," he said, "Hey, I own that. Look at the transformation. Look at the process I've undergone, and own it." Okay. He owned it. And now his transformation becomes a prescription for other people. Well, this is what we're doing with Washington initially, but now look at it in a larger picture. The case of Liberia becomes a prescription for how someone who went through a transformation knows how to move decisively in the interest of African people, even when there are multiple factors at play. Okay. So hang on that one point. Okay. Because of the fact that I'm going to return to it. It's more complex than simply black and white, right? The inhabitants of Liberia would be the indigenous Liberian ethnic groups. And then there would be this group called American Liberians who will come and resettle in Liberia after enslavement in America. And so both would be Black. However, what would happen there would be indicative of the conflicts on the ground that arise and the ideologies that would arise between the different ideologies that existed and that would arise as a result of that setting. Okay. And I think most of you who are on the African continent can relate to this because out here in the Americas is very simple for us. Be wary of people who classify themselves as white. But on the continent of Africa, it becomes far more complex, right? We know that people, and it's like that out here too. There are many Black and brown people who do not represent the same interest and are diametrically opposed to each other. However, on the African continent, not however, and on the African continent, you have people who are African and identifiably Black who will go against each other's better interest, right? And serve the interest of other people who classify themselves as Europeans or as non-African or non-Black. So this case challenges some of the very things that come up in light of our realities. Okay. So let me get back to the details of this particular case. So in 1907, 1908, Booker T. Washington receives a letter from a man named Ernest Lyons. Hold on one second. I know you all can see my screen. So I have this alarm that keeps going off and I'm gonna stop it. Okay. So a man contacts Booker T. Washington named Ernest Lyons. And Ernest Lyons is actually an individual who works for the U.S. government. He is stationed in Liberia and he sees what's going on on the ground. The French, the British, and the German colonial forces want to annex parts of Liberia. They want to take parts of Liberia and make it their own. They are intolerant of Liberia being independent and free. And so they attempt to take this territory. Why? Because it is not owned by any other European power at the time. And their attitude, specifically the British and the French, is that, hey, if no other European nation that can take and hold this territory militarily has claimed Liberia, then hey, we're going to claim it. We're going to take it. And so there are threats going back and forth between the French and the British with regard to Liberia and seizing the territory. In Liberia, there are the indigenous African populations, various ethnic groups, and then there is the settler group called American Liberians, who are African people who survived the institution of slavery and were repatriated by the American Colonization Society, which was involved in establishing this territory called Liberia. So not to say that Liberia comes into existence when Africans from the United States are resettled there. But what actually happens instead, what actually happens is that a racist organization in the United States who wanted uh, to remove Africans who were enslaved in the United States and settle them in Africa initiates the official franchise called Liberia as a country. Prior to that, it's just like the rest of the African continent before colonialism, right? The people are living in their natural formations in terms of ethnic variation, kingdoms, nations, right? Empires. So at this moment in time, what in 1847 or around or about, this organization, out of the racist desire to remove Africans who survived slavery and send them back to Africa, would initiate this franchise, so to speak, called Liberia that has borders. And it is a territory initially. The French and the British mainly, but the German are also a part of it. The French and the British are fighting over it. Okay. And Liberia is basically, the Liberian people are really somewhat vulnerable to this fighting between the French and the British because both are looking to impose colonial domination. Okay. That is the purpose for them, to impose a colonial setup. Now, the one problem with Liberia is that neither the French or the British or the United States, who is not really interested in Liberia in that way at that moment, have not figured out the resources that Liberia has. So they really don't know how to exploit Liberia. And yes, when you're talking about European nations and African nations, European nations, which are resource poor, and African nations, which are resource rich and wealthy, the main point or the main goal in contact is to utilize that locale or location as an extraction site. Okay. Not to develop it, not to enrich it, not to care for the people or uplift it is to exploit. And consequently, in order to exploit the land, you must oppress the people. Okay. And so this is what both are looking to do, the French and the British. So Ernest Lyons is watching all of this. He's terrified and he's trying to figure out what he can do to help the situation. He is the U.S. Consul to Liberia. He doesn't feel like he's getting the support from from the United States, so it seems, and he's not, because the United States doesn't really care. They're kind of like, resettle those Black people, get them out of here, and we don't really care what happens so much, even though the U.S. Navy is sitting on the coast of Africa outside of Liberia, right? So it's sitting, Liberia obviously is on the west coast of Africa, sitting on the coast, and is putting down conflicts between the Americo-Liberian population and the indigenous Liberian populations and ethnic groups. Okay, and that's an unfortunate thing, right? So we are having conflicts on the ground, and I'll get more into that. Liberia is located between two formidable powers. This is Ernest Lyons writing to Booker T. Washington. Liberia is located between two formidable powers, each of which is determined that neither shall secure any territorial advantages over the other. England on the northwest declares that she has no desire for Liberia's territory, but if French encroachments in the southeast are not checked, she will be obliged for national defense to imitate France on the Northwest. Liberia is unable to check France, and unless the United States interferes, the impairment of the independence of Liberia is inevitable. So, in other words, he's writing Booker T. Washington to say that the French and the British are fighting, and this is going to impede the independence, impair the independence of Liberia if this behavior goes unchecked, and like we need help. So Booker T. Washington responds. Booker T. Washington responds to him favorably and says, yes, basically, we need to work on this issue in Liberia. And he contacts Roosevelt. Now, all American presidents, in my opinion, are in the same category, because a lot of people say, oh, well, so-and-so is the first one to not be a racist or to not be this or that. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. America is an expression of white nationalism. All of its presidents were willing to uphold that. I think that's all the conversation we need to say about white American presidents. They led a country that is an expression of white nationalism. Okay. So one guy could be nicer than the other, or this or that or the other. However, and this includes Obama as well, even though he is a brown person, he has African ancestry, all of that. He was the president of a country that was an expression of white nationalism. So you should never think of any American president as anything other than a keeper of what the nation actually is. Okay. And sure, they may do little things here or there that seem like they serve the interests of other people, but still only serve the interests of the United States as an expression of white nationalism. And I know that I'm saying something to an extent controversial at this time, but I think it's important for people to know the truth so that they can protect their sanity. It's not good or healthy for us to believe lies, particularly lies about the United States of America, mainly because whether you're in this country or not, the way this country moves can impact another country and its citizens' reality and fate. So it's not healthy or good to be delusional about it, right? That being said, Theodore Roosevelt would get involved in the Liberian crisis at the behest of Booker T. Washington. Washington would, in fact, be an advisor to two American presidents. And what was he an advisor to them about? He was an advisor to them about the African population, the Black population, what they called then the Negro population in the United States. Okay, he was their key advisor. In this instance, he is essentially soliciting Theodore Roosevelt's energy and attention on the case of Liberia in order to help preserve Liberia. And this is where, and it's nuanced, but this is where we need to understand something. He is going to negotiate with, essentially the devil. And I'm not calling people the devil, but the phrase, doing deals with the devil in order to help your own. He is going to, dance, do deals, all of that with the devil to get the outcomes or something close to the outcomes he wants. What he wants, just to skip to not the end, but to the bottom line. What does Washington want? He wants to preserve Liberia. He wants Liberia to survive. He does not want the French to get Liberia. He does not want the British to get Liberia. He wants Liberia to remain an independent African nation, one of only two independent African nations on the continent of Africa that have never been colonized. Okay. And so he is working for that. that being said, he's not unaware of the factors that are at play behind the scenes, meaning on the ground in Liberia. We know this. African people, we sometimes have conflicts with each other. We will act out racism, we will act out xenophobia, right? Which are not pathologies that belong to us, but we will act these things out, okay, with each other. And until we understand that those things don't serve our interests, we will continue to act them out. And on the ground in Liberia, there are multiple clashes between the Americo-Liberian population and the indigenous Liberian population who has never been removed from Africa. And like I said, the US Navy is sitting off the coast of Liberia. It puts down, it interrupts these clashes, but that's it, nothing else. Okay. And Washington understands that this is not a good situation. He gets involved, contacts Roosevelt, brings the Librarian Commission to the United States, as you can see in this image, and I will tell you who they are. They are former presidents and vice presidents of Liberia. And they come to the United States so Washington can really help them cut some kind of deal. Now, to some degree, that could be delusional. On another extent, when you understand the outcomes, it's not delusional, but it is dangerous, okay? Because it could possibly not go the way Washington wants it to go. And Liberia ultimately, I give you a summary, Liberia ultimately ends up being a case where the nation survives to live another day, but all the outcomes are not the best outcomes. Okay. It's not the best deal, but it's the only deal going. It's a staving off immediate eradication of the nation versus survival under not so favorable conditions, but survival nonetheless that gives one the opportunity to survive and possibly fight again for one's nation. So, and I'll get more specific about that, but just right now, I zoomed in on the picture just a little bit because I'm going to give you the Librarian Commission that is in this image here. Here you have the Librarian Commission to the U.S. hosted in Tuskegee by Booker T. Washington, standing left to right. So standing, here we have Charles Branch, Secretary Representative of the Librarian Commission. In the middle, you have Booker T. Washington, right here in the middle. And then you have to his right, Secretary Representative of the Librarian Commission. I'm sorry, President of Tuskegee Institute. Okay, to the right of Booker T. Washington, the heavyset guy with the mustache, you have Charles Anderson. You have Charles Anderson, collector of the Internal Revenue. And then seated to the left, there's three men seated. You have Charles B. Dunbar, G.H. Gibson in the middle, and he's the former president of Liberia, and J.J. Dawson, former vice president of the Liberia to his right, as we look in the picture. So the three men sitting are Charles Dunbar, G.H. Gibson, former president of Liberia, and to his right, J.J. Dawson, former vice president of Liberia. And then seated on the ground right here, that's Washington Secretary Emmett J. Scott. And on the other side, you have Thomas Calloway. And Thomas Calloway is somebody who his brother would be involved in the Togo expedition. but he and his brother would get around quite a bit in terms of internationally being involved in some very important cases. So these individuals are not just any place. This right here is primary evidence that Washington, in fact, brought this commission not only to the United States and Washington, D.C., but brought them down to Tuskegee, okay, where they would strategize on how to approach the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, Elihu Root of the United States, in order to get the kind of outcomes that they needed with regard to Liberia. Okay. And so that is the purpose of this meeting. Washington wants to give them pomp and circumstance, celebrate their arrival. Roosevelt says no, but Washington refuses to negate their presence and says, no, we're going to celebrate them, even though things are not good. The nature of the trip, we are going to celebrate them, and we are going to bring them down to Tuskegee and, engage for some time. So I'm going to just get into the conclusion, because this is a very long case, and I just wanted to highlight those couple of points. So I try not to read you all, but I'm going to just read some of the last major points here. So the conclusion: in many ways, the findings of the case highlight that the uphill battle Booker T. Washington fought. Washington used the crisis of 1907 to get the attention of U.S. political officials who, after years of American indifference, allowed Liberia to secure a much needed loan that ended the immediate threat of encroachment. Had it not been for Washington's public involvement, as well as his close personal relationship with President Roosevelt, the U.S. may not have assisted Liberia at all. So in other words, the United States is not really gung-ho about Liberia. They really could care less, because they haven't figured out how to exploit Liberia. The reality is that Washington presses them and even threatens. If you read the case, he goes to the point of threatening Roosevelt, saying that, whatever you do or fail to do right now, it will be remembered by 4 million Negroes, African people in America, when it comes time to vote. So it's interesting to hear that, because people saw Washington as someone who did not believe in social and political rights, even though in this case, when you look at the details, and this comes from the personal paper, so this is deep research, you see him leveraging the Black vote as a wager against what he wants Roosevelt to do, and then Taft to do for Liberia. He's saying, hey, you don't help Liberia, the people here are going to know about it. They identify with Liberia. They care about Liberia. It'll say you abandoned Liberia, and they will remember that during voting time. So he's I don't want to say he's playing with them, because he is serious about what he's talking about. He is ruthless, but for the right reason, in my opinion. Okay, he's ruthless. We need to be ruthless. We need to be ruthless for African people, serving our interests, protecting ourselves, eradicating racism and xenophobia, and making sure that we have the right, just like everyone else, to walk this earth undisturbed, unmolested, without negation on every level. That's the point of our struggle, right? So he is saying Liberia deserves to exist. Liberia should not be encroached upon. And if you don't help Liberia, these African people within the United States are going to remember that you did not when it comes time to vote. And we know all you care about is us voting for you so you can stay in political power. So he leverages the vote. Had it not been for Washington's public involvement, as well as his close personal relationship with President Roosevelt, the U.S. may not have assisted Liberia at all. Like the case that follows, there is a moment where Washington had to make a decision regarding common interest. Washington's response to the request for help could have been met with a resounding no. However, not only did he agree with the existence of Liberia, but he identified with both the American Liberian population as well as the native Liberian populations. He had decided against aggressively negotiating on behalf of Liberia. the outcome would have been very different. So he had decided against aggressively negotiating on the behalf of Liberia. Had he, decided against negotiating. So correction, had he decided against negotiating on behalf of Liberia, the outcome would have been very different. Washington's presence and activity in this particular case was the only unique variable in the Liberian Crisis of 1908-1909. U.S. officials and presidents had previously intervened in Liberia, but the U.S. was asked to act officially. Legislators, historically, but when the U.S. was asked to act officially, legislators have historically refused to make any significant commitment to the country. So in the past, whoever has been asked officially to help Liberia has refused to do so. Okay, and then there's Washington. The details of the case are direct evidence of Washington's contribution to African policy. His intention to protect Liberia from foreign encroachments is evident throughout the correspondence with President Roosevelt, Secretary of War, and later President William Staff, and Secretary of State Elihu Root. Ernest Lyons chose Booker T. Washington in part and in particular due to his influence in political circles and establishments and advisory role to several U.S. presidents. Although Washington was neither a U.S. nor Liberian official, all parties acknowledged that he was a key negotiator and advisor and wielded considerable influence and power in the U.S. and internationally. Through his ongoing rapport with Roosevelt and later Taft, he was able to secure U.S. commitments that had significant strategic value to Liberia and helped maintain the country's stability. Washington's directly influenced every aspect of the case: diplomacy, actual negotiations, advisement, fundraising, and recommendations. It is very likely that without his intervention, both French and British forces would have annexed Liberia on this particular occasion. However, conclusively, what should be highlighted here is that as soon as Liberia was secure, Washington attempted to transport his philosophy of self-help, which we know is a path to independence and sustainability. His recommendations were based on the Tuskegee model to own and operate industry and to eliminate dependency. The Tuskegee dependency. The interpretive aspects of the case highlight that the historical relationship between the U.S. and Liberia was traditionally undefined. The U.S. as a stakeholder in the case viewed Liberia as an informal territory. The British and the French, who had strategically desired to annex Liberia, viewed the new nation as an uncolonized territory in Africa. If gone unclaimed, would be absorbed by both or one of the colonial powers. Americo-Liberians, to a large degree, viewed the nation as a colony of the U.S., although relationship was repeatedly called into question. So although the relationship was repeatedly called into question, meaning that the United States is not supporting economically or otherwise Liberia or its Black and African expats or settlers in the country. It's just sitting off the coast and saying, hey, good, you guys are going there, no problem. We're not giving you any money. We're not supporting you. And the only reason why they're not doing that is because they haven't figured out how to exploit Liberia. That point, though, is also important in understanding why it was important for Washington to get involved, because he is the one who will force the United States through his own threats, basically, to help Liberia get out of being annexed, since the United States is only one at that moment who does not have strategic value or interest in Liberia. So you're talking about negotiating with three imperialist nations, essentially, and striking a fine balance to make sure that the gem in the middle, what you want in the middle of all three of them, which is Liberia, does not get crushed by these essentially imperialist colonial forces. And I might want to add diabolical forces, because you know, none of them are doing any good. The problem, just to make sense of this case, not the problem, the issue with the United States, why the United States doesn't come in and just claim Liberia, is because they are not innocent. They are exploiting South America and Latin America, just to the south of them. And they have committed their energies to that. This is why they don't care about Liberia at the moment. Okay. And so the case would reveal some important things in the end about what Liberia did have. And the United States will negotiate on that basis to a certain extent, meaning the United States would have a military base set up in Liberia in the future, would have Firestone established in the country, right, because of the rubber market, but they're not aware of this in the real time, the context I'm talking about. It comes as a result of this specific case in 1907, 1912 in the end. And what else is the other negotiation? Those are two of the three. It's in the case. So the point is this: Washington, through long, very tedious strategizing and negotiation, he is able to negotiate a deal where Liberia, in essence, survives. And it's not a short case. It is a test of endurance. It is a long case, 5 years, and he is able to negotiate these conditions long term. Now, why is this important? It's important because he, throughout all of this, knows what he's doing and whom he is doing it for. And it's no simple scenario. You understand his intentions and very clear objectives when he gives his personal recommendations to Liberia. And he is clear about what he wants to see for Liberia in terms of its survival. Okay. So let me just go through Washington's recommendations. Booker T. Washington gave his own recommendations in which he communicated directly to Ernest Lyons and President Daniel Howard of Liberia. His advice and recommendations addressed three important areas of Liberian life: education, economics, and the social relations that had been disrupted since the settlement of the Americo-Liberian population in the country. First, Washington warned President Howard regarding the rift between Liberians and Americo-Liberians. Washington knew that the conflicts between the two groups held the potential to destabilize the nation. He suggested that the whole future of Liberia hinges upon its ability to get a hold of the native population, and the tribal Liberian has a very real grievance against the minority of Americo-Liberian descendants of deported American slaves who ran the government and controlled the economy of Liberia, he's saying. So Washington, because he's born in the United States, and he is certainly an African who survived the institution of slavery in the United States, he is not on the side of the Americo-Liberian population in terms of its conflict with the indigenous Liberian population. Why? Because he understands that the Americo-Liberian population has engaged in marginalizing the indigenous African population and Liberian population in Liberia. So that's like me coming back to Africa, going back home to the continent of Africa, and then acting racist, acting biased towards African people who have never left the African continent. Problem. It could be described as sort of a xenophobia, right? It's one of the things we struggle against in this organization. The African from the United States goes back to Liberia and then institutionalizes the same system of discrimination and marginalization that they just escaped, with exception to the slave context, right? They don't impose slavery, but they come and they create a system that marginalizes the indigenous Liberian. Very problematic, very problematic. And if you read the case, I sharply criticize it. Why do I sharply criticize it? Because it is a teaching and is a learning moment for us and how to deal with each other. Very important. And if we don't highlight issues like this, then it only is a negative. It cannot be prescriptive. It cannot be instructive. Right? So it wouldn't be good for me to say, hey, African people from the United States went back to Liberia and everything was fine. That's not true. Everything wasn't fine. Everything wasn't okay. They needed see what we're moving through right here in this session? This is called ideological development, where we get our minds right to do the kind of work that serves the interests of African and Black people. They lacked that. They go back to Liberia, the indigenous African population, the African population from the United States goes back to Liberia with very Western, Eurocentric thinking. And we would call it, in the political sense, contradictions. Okay? Washington, shortly before this, goes through a catastrophe where he's aligned with the German colonial forces and loses all his students and makes him come into the understanding like, no, I can never be on that other side. I can never consciously or unconsciously be an agent or actor for people who are against African people. When he goes in, that situation prepares him for this one right here, the Liberian crisis. So even though the complexity of Liberia is understanding that some of these people on the ground in Liberia come from the very group, the ethnic group that we have constructed in America of African people who survived slavery, I cannot agree with them when they are fundamentally wrong and interrupting the lives and well-being of African people in Liberia who have never been displaced. Oppression is wrong, period. Right? No matter who the perpetrator is, oppression is wrong. So he takes a very critical position on, and that is what I'm reading at this point. His first recommendation to the president: resolve the conflict between the indigenous Liberian ethnic groups and people and the Americo-Liberian population. If you do not solve this problem between the two groups, it will be the death of Liberia. And his words were prophetic, because we know, those of you who are from Liberia, this would be the problem. This issue is the seed. Americo-Liberian, indigenous Liberian, or native Liberian. This problem would be the seed of issues to come for at least 100 years in Liberia. Right? It gives birth to a class of people who are Black, but do not necessarily serve the interests of African people in general, of Black people in general. They create their own elitist group called Americo-Liberian. And if you all know about Liberia, some of you may even be in Liberia, you know that all the presidents of Liberia come from this particular group, which constitutes itself today as an ethnic group, right? Americo-Liberian. So, I hate to even mention his name, but the Taylors, who was destructive force and part of the CIA in Liberia, U.S. CIA in Liberia, and a destructive force that will allow, many wars to happen, but specifically the 13 Years' War to go on, which the women of Liberia put to an end some years ago under Lima Bowie. But my point of bringing that up is that we have to be able to distinguish behavior, right? Behavior and ideology. And Washington is able to make that distinction. He condemns the presence and the actions, not even the presence, but the actions of the Americo-Liberian in Liberia. And he urges the president in private recommendations to get that together, because it will destroy the nation. Our conflicts between Africans, it will do our opposers' job. Let me say it another way. The conflicts between African people and Black people, it will undo us. We will destroy ourselves from within to the benefit of other people. And it doesn't even matter who those other people are, right? And in most instances, in terms of Africa and the Americas, it's usually European and people who have identified as whites, have taken on the identification or the culture of whiteness. However, it doesn't matter who our detractors are. Our unity is the remedy to all of it. And so we have to engage in a conscious struggle for unity, which is always an ideological struggle. Washington is calling out the contradictions here in Liberia. Yes, the group that comes from where I come from is causing a problem in Liberia, and it needs to be resolved because the indigenous African population has a very legitimate issue. So let me just read that quickly again, go into the others and then move on. First, Washington warned President Howard regarding the rift between Liberians and Americo-Liberians. Washington knew that the conflicts between the two groups held the potential to destabilize the nation. He suggested that the whole future of Liberia hinges upon its ability to get a hold of the native population. For the tribal, and I don't like that word tribal because that's really a Western term. So for the indigenous Liberian, has a very real grievance against the minority of Americo-Liberians, descendants of deported American slaves who ran the government and controlled the economy. Although African-American, Washington was acutely aware of the inherent injustice involved in resettling formerly enslaved Africans back in Liberia, especially as they in turn attempted to colonize Liberia and institutionalize American-style discrimination practices and policies in their new country. Washington warned that failure to resolve conflicts between the two populations would hinder the nation's growth and threaten its eventual stability. Okay. The second recommendation Washington gives to President Howard is to develop and implement industrial education and programs aimed to stimulating the establishment of industry in the country. Washington had a very shrewd outlook on economic advancement, and regardless of his relations with Western officials, he advised Liberia against the consumption of Western goods. Writing to the Liberian Register, he said, "Every time a Liberian eats a tin can of goods imported from any other country, it means poverty for Liberians. It means that Liberians are paying somebody else to manufacture the tin cans and paying the freight upon the cans. And all of this, of course, means money taken out of Liberia." So he's saying independence through industry, Own and operate your own industries. Do not consume Western goods. Consume what you produce. Cut them out of this deal. Okay. Although Washington has often been cited as pro-capitalist, his inclination was to protect Liberia from the pitfalls of consumption as opposed to production. Conceptually, this belief is consistent with Washington's philosophy of sustainable economic independence, which was essential to developing Liberia as a nation. He is invested in Liberia's development and survival as a nation. Stop consuming Western goods. And we already know all over the African continent, we have a formula that is in play. The production of raw materials and European being sent to European industries, factories, and they they basically put it in a can, okay? And it goes through their industries and then they send it back into Africa. And if that's food, they send it back in a can with a ton of salt and tax on the can. And now we consume in the African continent, we consume the very things we produce below our feet, but for a price. Okay, not the raw goods anymore. Okay, so he is criticizing this. This is, in 1912, 100 years ago. So we understood the nature of our problem. We have not been able to overcome it as of yet. But the recommendations, the consciousness was there, right? Saying these are the problems we need to address. And remember, this is a conversation Washington is having with the president of Liberia, another African, and saying, listen, okay, we got out of this problem. These are the things that you need to do to ensure Liberia's survival and independence and not dependence on any European nation who will exploit the country and then compromise its liberation ultimately. Third, Washington recommended that Liberia establish an industrial school. Philosophically, Washington subscribed to the view that establishing industry was an important part of building economic independence, and industrial education would facilitate it. Therefore, Washington and Olivia E. Phelps Stokes collaborated in founding Booker T. Washington Industrial Institute in Liberia. So there is a Tuskegee Institute in Liberia. Both were deceased by the time the school was actually open. Washington, working with Stokes' support, also put into place a short-term plan to admit Liberian and America Liberian students to Tuskegee. Okay, so that's the end of the case. There is, and I left out the caveats in terms of the actual deal. You have to read it for yourself because there's a lot of hills and valleys in that case. Let me just give you, so that's the visual. The next case we'll be looking at is the African exclusion measure, and it's much shorter. I'm going to stop here just so we can talk about this. I think it's better, but just so you get a visual, the next case and the final case in this particular book is the African exclusion measure. And once again, this is Washington challenging the US government to the benefit of African people. And that certainly was what Liberia was, right? So this is Washington challenging the US government to the benefit of Liberia. Okay. He gets nothing out of this deal, to be quite frank. And all of this, just so you all know, because I think for us here in the West and on the African continent, what we suffer under and suffer from so often as African people, as Black people, we suffer under people who look like us, our own leadership, the egos of our own leadership, right? That stops them from serving the interests of our people, acting in favor of our people. And so I want to highlight and point out that this case was not in the public realm. Few knew about the details of this case when it was going on. Okay. Washington did not tell people what he was up to. This was all private and secret negotiations on his part. And so some of us, not all of us, want to know. Everybody doesn't need to know everything, right? And the reason why he does it that way is to protect the negotiations, to protect what he's trying to do, to, in a very difficult, long, protracted situation, bring about outcomes that are favorable to African people and to the survival of the independent African nations. So everybody doesn't need to know, right? Because they may undermine the interest, you know. So this is a long, protracted struggle and negotiations, but then you will have this scenario, which will be the African exclusion measure, the final case in the book, and that you read, and much shorter. But this scenario, Washington challenges the United States around some racist legislation that said to exclude anyone of the Black or African race, and would exclude all of the people coming from any of these countries, and including the African continent, because they wanted to make sure that when the Panama Canal was completed, that African people who had worked on the Panama Canal would not immigrate to the United States. Okay. I'm going to let you read the details on your own, but the important thing here was that Washington, in this case, Washington is challenging the United States government, and he sends his secret network to Washington, D.C., to directly challenge U.S. politicians, okay, and stop them from voting favorably. This measure, the African exclusion measure, which was really an amendment proposed by the Senate, namely a senator by the name of James Reed from Missouri. This measure would be proposed in the Senate and passed in the Senate on December 31st, 1914. This case would be fought within a week successfully, because Washington realized when it passed in the Senate, this larger immigration bill with this amendment in it would go to the House. And if it passed, everyone who looked Black and is African would be locked out from the United States from 1915 onward to now. That meant Marcus Garvey could have never come into the United States the very next year. Those of you who like Obama, no Obama in the United States, because Obama's father would have never come into the United States. Doors would have been locked on African immigration coming from anywhere. It was directed at African population in the Caribbean, Central, and South America, who had worked on the Panama Canal, but it would include anybody who looked Black, anybody who was in fact coming from Africa or anything like that, putting us wrongfully in a category, classifying us as undesirables and criminals in attempting to enter the country. So let me say it again. This racist measure that was added to the larger immigration bill of 1915, it would, based on this fictitious model of race, and yes, definitely culture is real, culture, it would say to exclude anyone of the Black or African race from 1915 on, and put them, because of race and culture, in the same category as a criminal or a undesirable attempting to enter the United States. It was Booker T. Washington who would fight on every front in the Black press, through his secret network called the Tuskegee Machine, and through other negotiations, if necessary, going directly to Woodrow Wilson, who was a staunch racist, but he was willing to challenge him directly. but he takes a number of methods: Black press, the Tuskegee machine, and essentially challenging some US officials specifically who he felt were invested in this measure. His words that challenge this measure make its way to the floor of the House of Representatives, Congress. You know, that place that got attacked like, 2-3 months ago? Yeah, Congress. So where they debate these issues. Washington's words, although he is not a legislator, although he is not a politician, he is powerful enough to use his secret network to get his words on the floor of the House through a U.S. congressman in New York. Okay. And he is able to hold up Congress to the point where he can poll congressmen and congresswomen and challenge this measure by targeting those who were in support of it. He is successful. This case, unlike the Liberian Crisis, takes place in 1 week. 1 week, 5 business days. If he had to get his consciousness together and say, hey, the measure reads to exclude anyone of the Black or African race. That's the exact reading. If he was confused about who that was, hey, it's only these people or only that people, or it's not me. I'm already in the United States. So what? If he had to come through those internal deliberations, this case would have had a different outcome. He was already aware that he was African and consequently Black. Okay. He was already aware that he was willing and was an active agent in the interests of African people and Black people. So he is able to move swiftly and decisively in the case of the African exclusion measure. If that happens today, I don't know that the outcome would be the same. Okay. Why? Because people would oppose such a measure, but very likely would not have organized methods to challenge it in such a short frame of time. And yes, America, the United States is just as racist today as it was in 1915 when this measure passes in the Senate and is due to go to the House. Okay. But Washington was a Pan-Africanist. He's already in the United States. You don't have to worry about immigration, but he has a steady stream of students coming from the African continent specifically. And this is his mission. This is his vision. This is his investment. He is invested in us having these dialectical relationships. He is invested in us benefiting from our interactions to serve our collective interests. He is not willing to allow the United States government to close the doors to Africans internationally. And yes, he wants them to come to the United States and benefit, because that benefit is all of our benefit collectively. Most of the students who would come to Tuskegee from Africa would return to Africa to take their methods and what they learned and implement it on the African continent and build their countries. So he is invested as a Pan-Africanist. This is one of the most significant cases because he has, if he's not a Pan-Africanist, he has no reason to ferociously fight this case as he does. And I'm not going to get to the details because it's so short. You can read it on your own. And it's literally the last document I posted in our WhatsApp group. But he is ferocious and he is determined and he's clear. He says, if I had failed to defeat this measure in the House of Representatives, I had already decided I would have gone directly to I'm injecting this racist Woodrow Wilson, and demanded that it be vetoed. Now, I don't know how good that would have worked. He was an advisor. He was not an advisor to Woodrow Wilson. He didn't have the same pull. He still had significant power. However, he did not have it in the sense that he influenced any US president. He had the kind of power that you see him express, soft power. He could take his own vehicle, a secret network of power brokers, and send them to Washington to pretty much strong arm American politicians into not voting favorably for this measure that was attached to the large immigration bill. He could influence other politicians to echo his direct words on the floor of the House, arguing against this measure. Okay, he had significant control of the Black press, where he could expose this measure to the masses and say, listen, this is what the United States government is doing, this racist measure that seeks to lock us out. We have never been an adverse people. And he's saying lock us out, meaning, yes, to him, the African outside of the United States is the same as the African within the United States. Okay. And so he is able to act on our collective interests. Had he failed, like I said, Marcus Garvey the very next year would not have been brought into the United States, could not have come from Jamaica to the United States. He would have been locked out. Little Obama, he would have never existed. His daddy would never came to the United States. Malcolm X, I can't even begin to. We love Malcolm X, but Malcolm X would not have been one of our fighters within the United States because his mother's ancestry comes from Africans who were in the Caribbean. We can go on and on and on and on and on. The number of people who would not have come into the United States and joined forces, aligned with us in our struggles for our people collectively. Okay. Nkrumah, as we're going to get into, would never have been able to come into the United States, get the education, raise his consciousness, and go back and be the first president of an independent African nation, the first independent African nation, or to rid itself from colonialism, called the Gold Coast, now Ghana. Okay. Nnamdi Ezekwe would have never come. So many who have benefited from us coming together to do some of what we're doing right now, emboldening and strengthening, arming each other ideologically to prepare ourselves for our collective fight to eradicate racism and exploitation in the world as it exists. This is the what that final case is about. The African exclusion measure. Okay, so I did something I said I was not going to do, which was like go into that case and finish it up. But okay, we only have a few people on here anyway. Go into the case and finish it up without taking Q&A. So I'm going to take Q&A now. And hopefully folks are still there. And I know we're on a live. Are we on what kind of live? Oh, we're on YouTube live. Okay. So I'm going to do Q&A about those two cases. Good. I'm glad you are. I'm going to take the questions in the chat, and I will be even more disciplined next week, even though not so bad. 12:26 is what I have here. And usually we're not at this point in the session. We're kind of usually further behind. Any questions? Any questions? Any questions about the two cases? And so those are two, when people talk about Pan-Africanism, those are two concrete scenarios where it was to our benefit and we had an agent to work in the interests of African people, not in some esoteric way, but in a concrete, tangible way that brings about results for us collectively. So anybody have any questions? No? All right, so then I can wrap it up. I guess this is video. I hope, Alex, you can use this for the rest of the group because we have very few people still in. I know some folks had to leave. Okay, but I see a couple of, so nobody else has any questions? No? All right, so that's good. I think I covered all the bases. Some of you heard this information before. Those of you who are part of I Love Black People. Alrighty, so I'm gonna stop there. And the next, so this is the first week where I have to put up the new readings because I gave you the first 2 to 3 weeks off the bat. So I'll be putting up the new readings and I'll revise the syllabus so that folks can see where we're at. And that being moving into a space where we start to look at other proponents. So this is just a model. Washington, we get a model, we get some understanding, we get a little history about Pan-Africanism and organized efforts. Now we are moving to other proponents of the ideology and how they express that. And I've added new information because then we'll get a chance to look at people like Thomas Sankara. We'll get a chance to look at people like, of course, we cover Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Amilcar Cabral, and others who are working for the collective interests of African people. But we get a chance to see the highest expression of Pan-Africanism as it manifests itself on the African continent as African independence. And that's extremely important. Okay. So I'm going to leave it there until next week. And we got to figure out how to get more people in. We usually have a lot of people in here before when we did this on Saturdays.
Right.
Huh? Yes?
Yeah, I'm just saying, right. I think we need to, like, I'll try and get people on the group during the course of the week.
Sundays is hard, right? Sundays is hard for people to do. Right. So let me ask you a question. Mm-hmm. We're still having all the sessions on Saturdays, right? We're still having all the sessions on Saturdays, right?
What?
We're still having all the sessions on Saturdays.
Yes, we're still doing that.
Right. So then for people who are ambassadors, you're asking them basically to come in on the Saturday and Sunday. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So see, we need to reevaluate that. Possibly,
Yeah, so, I think that makes sense. I think during the course of this week we can look into maybe changing the things up to increase the attendance.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Well, the people who want to see this, who are not here today or could not stay, I saw some had to leave. Will they be able to see this? Where will they be able to see this particular recording of our session?
Yeah, so we have it up on our website. That's on iloveblackpeople.com/media.
Okay, so that's where they can see it. Yes. That's where they can see it. Okay. Yes. All right, sounds good. All right, folks. So if no one has any questions, thank you once again. Any day is rest day for my family. We will adjust with whatever schedule you all choose. Thank you so much. My twin daughters, Phoebe and Hannah, are also listening. Wonderful. They're going to be ahead of everybody else and know how to serve us collectively very well from a young age. I think you said they were 12, right? Are they 12? Did you say how old they were last time? Oh, 13. Okay, I'm one off. All right, I was close, but 13 is good. Good. Prime age for ideological development. Wonderful. Okay, the consciousness will be super high. So thank you all. And I will be posting new readings, actually, even typically I would be doing it on a Monday, but you might see them before that because most of them I have scanned already. Okay. All right. So I will see you all next week. Be safe. New readings coming up. Oh, you're in law school right now. Who is that? Oh, Malicia. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Oh, wow. They're interested in Egyptian history. That's very interesting. Oh, you're in law school and your girls are interested. Your twins are interested in Egyptian history. Yes, I know. I love it. Me too. Our antiquity. And thank you, Willie. I see you and Malicia. Okay. Well, let me tell you, I try to go just as hard, whether it's 1 or 100. Sometimes we have had 100 people, but I don't care. Like, I hope some of what I presented landed and gave you a deeper understanding of what I Love Black People is doing and why we're doing it. Okay. All right. So everyone stay safe and have a good weekend. And I will see you all next week, but you will certainly hear from me early in the week with new readings. I have never heard the information. Okay, you're giving us. My twins tell their private online school about this. Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Oh, thank you too, Pascal. Thank you. They tell their private online school about. Well, that's a good thing. Good thing. It's a good thing, right? So until next week, I appreciate that. I appreciate that they're listening. I appreciate that they're getting the history that I feel like belongs to all of us, right? Because this information belongs to all of us, right? So, okay, have a good afternoon. And for those of you who are in places where it's evening, have a good evening, okay? I am because we are.